Hey everyone, I'm Cameron Bertuzzi, and welcome to the live stream. What I'm doing here on this channel, Capturing Christianity, is I'm exposing you to the intellectual side of Christian belief. Today I'm welcoming Dr. Tomas Bogardus back to the channel to discuss whether new concepts of gender pass the test of being logical. That's the subject of a recent paper that he published on the topic, and that's what we'll be talking about today. If you want to learn new exciting things about apologetics, you want to see intelligent conversations between Christians and non-Christians, then make sure to subscribe to my channel and turn on the little bell so you don't miss any new videos. Just popping over here, making sure that the live stream is looking good. Everything's looking great. All right, cool. So Dr. Tomas Bogardus, he is an associate professor of philosophy at Pepperdine University. He works mainly in metaphysics and epistemology, and he's most interested in the mind-body problem and the rationality of religious belief. Lately, however, he's sort of turned his analytic sights towards sex and gender, having recently published 2 peer-reviewed academic papers on the subject. The link to both of his papers are in the description of this video. Dr. Bogardus has also been on the channel before. He's actually been in one of my favorite interviews I've ever done on the channel, where we talked about the "had you been born elsewhere" objection to religious belief. Sometimes atheists will say that religious belief is unjustified because if you'd been born in Saudi Arabia, for example, you probably wouldn't be a Christian. And so that interview was devoted to that question, that objection. You can find it linked in the description of the video. So before we get into the interview, this is just a quick reminder that I support my wife and my very small 2 very young children through this ministry. So if you find the kind of work that I'm doing here valuable, please consider supporting me on a monthly basis. At $5 a month, you can gain early access to all of my videos, all my content, and you can also gain access to a private Facebook group called the Bereans. The link to support me and my family is in the description of the video. All right, well, let's get into the interview. Pulling up my interview scene here so we can see Dr. Tomas Bogardus. Thanks for coming on the show again. It's great to
I'm
have
happy
you,
to be
everybody.
here. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, no problem. So we're talking about a paper that you wrote. You've written 2 so far, and the first one is, remind me of the title again. I've got it linked here, but remind me of the title of the paper.
Some internal problems with revisionary gender concepts.
Yeah, and some of the terminology here is actually really odd. I've never seen any of it before. We're going to get into it. Like to help me understand, like, how do you actually say this ameliorative inquiry?
Ameliorative inquiry.
All right, we'll get into that in a minute. Well, Remind me, first of all, why you're interested in philosophy in the first place, and then we'll talk about gender.
Sure. Well, I think like a lot of people, I discovered an interest in philosophy in my early teens. I was raised in a religious household, and I went to Lutheran schools up through high school. And so I wasn't exposed to a lot of disagreement about theological or philosophical questions. But I remember the first time that I really encountered disagreement, I had a sort of girlfriend in high school who was an atheist, and she started asking questions like, how do you even know any of this stuff's true? And I have vivid memories of those conversations because it was the first time anybody ever asked me, like, why do you believe this stuff? So I think that was my first exposure to thinking philosophically and theologically. And then when I went to college, I went to a large public research university, went to UC San Diego and studied biology. And so there I encountered a whole lot of people who disagreed with me. So I was having a lot of late night conversations with friends, having conversations with people I worked with in laboratories about science and theology and philosophy. Although at the time I didn't know this stuff was called philosophy, I didn't know there was such a thing as philosophy, but when I discovered that the things that I enjoyed talking about were philosophical, then I decided to switch from biology to philosophy.
Well, tell me what got you into thinking about gender, because that seems almost out of left field. It's like you're thinking about metaphysics and mind-body problems and the rationality of religious belief, and then just straight to gender. So how did that transition happen? Because you've written, this is your second paper, right? Well, you've got one that just came out.
Yeah.
The one that we're talking about was one that came out how long ago?
I guess it was published on, it hasn't been published in an actual physical copy of the journal yet. It hasn't been assigned to an issue, but it was published online in late July, I think.
So yeah, this is very recent for you. So what got you?
Well, the publication part is recent, but I've actually been thinking about this stuff since I think 2016.
Okay.
It's just it took a while to get these papers accepted because the views that I'm defending are pretty unpopular among professional philosophers. And so I encounter a lot of resistance from referees for journals. So it took a long time to find the right journal and the right
That's
referee.
interesting. Interesting.
Yeah, interesting is one word for it. I mean, it was also super frustrating.
Yeah. So for people that aren't in academia, they don't really know that there's this whole process in peer review where you've got to go through these referees. So maybe explain like what you're talking about when you say referees and how all that works.
Yeah, so if you want to publish a paper in philosophy, you first have to try to find a journal that you think might be interested in the paper. And so that already limits my options because not very many philosophy journals publish stuff about sex and gender. And then there have been some, I don't know what the word is, scandal is not quite the right word, but sort of like brouhahas about papers having to do
Brouhaha
it.
is a better word.
Yeah, I guess so. Like Rebecca Tuvel was a junior philosopher who published a paper a few years ago where she made the mistake of just comparing transgender folks with transracial folks. And so the thought was all the arguments that we have for accepting that trans women are women look pretty analogous to the arguments that people like Rachel Dolezal are giving for the conclusion that you could be transracial as well. And she ran the modus ponens. She said, like, well, I accept trans individuals, so I should also accept transracial individuals. So she wasn't trying to do like a reductio or anything. But still, there was quite a lot of blowback and controversy over that paper. So I think that scared a lot of people off from writing on this topic. And I think it might have deterred a few editors from publishing papers on this topic because it wasn't just the author that got in trouble. It was also the editors of the journal that published their paper.
Well, it doesn't seem to have scared you away a whole lot.
Yeah, fortunately, I feel sort of professionally secure in my position at Pepperdine. And then also, like, I was thinking about it. I was thinking about this interview, and I tend to think of myself as non-confrontational. But when I reflect on the sort of activities that I engage in professionally and in my own personal life, it seems like I might be kind of confrontational. I sort of enjoy mixing it up a little bit.
All right, well, let's talk about your paper. So it's titled, again, Some Internal Problems with Revisionary Gender Concepts. And the abstract basically says that we can't revise our views on gender to make feminism trans-inclusive. So if you can, just sort of unpack what that means for us.
Sure. So there's a debate right now among feminist philosophers between what you might call trans-inclusive philosophers who want to defend and explain the slogan that trans women are women. They want trans women to count as women. So we can call those trans-inclusive philosophers. And then on the other side, there's a group of philosophers that describe themselves as gender-critical philosophers. And they tend to deny that trans women are really women. So there's a debate between those two. And I guess what I was doing in this paper was just, you could put it this way. I think that trans-inclusive philosophers have sort of set for themselves a really difficult task, if not an impossible task. And what makes this task so difficult is, well, you can call the problem the inclusion problem. Just sort of imagine in your mind all the people that trans-inclusive philosophers would like to include in the category of woman. And the problem is you have variation along every dimension you can think of. And so it's hard to see what all and only these people have in common to justify including them in a category. You have trans women and cis women, so they vary biologically.
Cis women is what?
So, okay, yeah, let's back up. So this trans-cis distinction was introduced back when it was assumed that there was a difference between sex and gender, when it was assumed by every party to the debate that there's a sex-gender distinction. And the idea was that you can arrange people on a sex spectrum. I don't know if you can see my hands, but
just raise it up a little bit.
Yeah, so the idea is like there's the spectrum of sex. There's like clear biological males over here, clear biological females over here. There are some intersex folks in between, but you can kind of imagine arranging people based on how clearly male or how clearly
There's a
female they are.
continuum.
Yeah, so that's biological sex.
Okay.
And then the thought was, well, that's different from gender. This is just a matter of whether you're male or female. But there's also the question of what gender you are. And it's a matter of some controversy what gender is. But the thought was you can arrange people based on how masculine or feminine they are. And then, I mean, typically this is hashed out just in terms of the crudest sort of stereotypes. So, like, if you have a child who likes blue and G.I. Joes and turning sticks into swords and so on, well, that's a very masculine sort of child, a boy sort of child. And if they like ribbons and pink and so on, like, I'm not endorsing these gender norms. I'm just telling you, like, this is how this gender spectrum is typically cashed out. If they like ribbons and pink and dolls and so on, then they're very feminine. And then the thought was, well, it's possible to be on one end of one of these spectra and on the other end of the other spectrum. And so the thought was, if you are biologically male and also masculine, then you're cisgendered. You're on the same side. So this prefix cis means on the same side, whereas
Gotcha.
trans means across or on different sides. And so if you're biologically male and very masculine, you're cisgendered. But if you're biologically male and feminine, if you're male but a woman or male but a girl, then you're transgendered because you're sort of on the opposite ends of these spectra.
That's actually really helpful.
All right. So since then, it's become less clear. I mean, it now looks like the trend among trans-inclusive philosophers is to deny that there's any sex-gender distinction. And so now the distinction between cis and trans is put in terms of your gender as opposed to what sex you were assigned at birth. That's where this phrase sex assigned at birth came from. And so these days, to be transgendered is to be, for example, a woman, but you were assigned male at birth. And the reason they couch male in this phrase assigned male at birth is because these days the trend among trans-inclusive philosophers is to reclaim not just gender terms, but also sex terms. And so the thought is, if you're a trans woman, not only are you a woman, but you're also female. You're not male after all. And so those two spectra that I sketched a second ago have been replaced, and now the new spectra are gender up here. You can be a man or a woman, or something else. And then this other spectrum down here isn't biological sex, it's sex assigned at birth. So if you're on the opposite ends of these spectra, you're transgender. If you're on the same side, you're cisgender. So anyway, the thought was just imagine in your mind's eye all the people that trans-inclusive philosophers want to include in the category of woman. And there's a whole lot of biological variation. There's people that are commonly described as biological males in this category. There's biological females in this category. You have a diversity of sexual orientation. You have homosexual people, heterosexual people, bisexual people, all sorts of sexual orientations. So there's nothing that unifies the class when it comes to sexual orientation. There's a whole lot of variation when it comes to life experience. There's people who sort of lived as a girl and a woman their whole lives. There are other people who transition later in life, and so their life experiences have been different. There's variation when it comes to degrees of oppression. So like the Queen of England is in this category, who hasn't experienced a great deal of oppression. And then there's also women who have experienced a whole lot of abuse and assault and oppression and so on. A high degree of marginalization. So the problem for trans-inclusive feminism, trans-inclusive philosophers, is they want to say that this extremely diverse set of people somehow constitutes a category that we should call woman. But it seems like there's literally nothing that all and only these people have in common. So that's the puzzle, and that's what makes it kind of philosophically interesting.
Yeah, so in the paper...
And you might think... Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say, going back to the paper, how is it that you sort of defend or look at this idea that we can't revise our views on gender to make feminism trans-inclusive?
Well, what I do is I try to pick up on the debate. We're sort of in the
Mhm.
middle of a debate, so I'm chiming in a little bit late. But here's how the debate has been going recently. So it used to be that a lot of feminists thought we should define womanhood in terms of your social role. So philosophers like Sally Haslinger at MIT defined womanhood in terms of in this way: to be a woman is to be oppressed along some dimension, like politically oppressed or economically depressed or socially oppressed. Did I say depressed? I meant
You
oppressed.
you did. It's okay.
You're oppressed along some dimension because you are observed or imagined to be biologically female. You don't have to actually be observed to be female. As long as people are sort of reading you as female and then oppressing you on that basis, then you're a woman. And if this isn't happening, then you're not a woman. So that was kind of the dominant view up through the 90s, I'd say, starting in the middle of the 20th century. But then with the rise of trans-inclusive feminism, a lot of philosophers started worrying that this is going to exclude a lot of trans women. Not all trans women are oppressed because they're read as female, if only because not all of them are read as female, and also because not all of them are oppressed. And
Yeah,
so
one of the
this
things you point out in the paper is that the Queen of England is not really oppressed, and so she wouldn't even qualify as a female on this view,
she wouldn't count. She wouldn't qualify as a woman
as a
on this
woman.
view. Yeah, yeah. So that's a section of the paper where I wonder whether counterexamples matter. And so let's set that aside for a second because I think you're going to want to talk about that later, like to what
Yep.
degree counterexamples matter. Let me just finish this brief history of the debate here. So the dominant view was the social role view of gender, and then trans-inclusive philosophers started worrying that the social role view wasn't sufficiently trans-inclusive. And so a philosopher named Katherine Jenkins wrote a paper in 2016 arguing that we should replace the social role view of womanhood with another view on which to be a woman is to take a sufficient number of the right kind of gender norms to be about you. So, for example, it's still kind of a gender norm that women should shave their legs. If you think that norm is about you, decide to abide by the norm, or maybe you decide to flout the norm, it doesn't really matter. As long as you think that norm is about you, then you're a woman on this account. And Katherine Jenkins' hope was this is going to include all trans women because they take enough of the right kind of gender norms to be about them.
Hmm.
And so what I do in my paper is I say, actually, this is the main worry about this definition is that it looks because it's a definition of womanhood. It says here's what it is
Wait,
to be a woman,
sorry, you're
and the
actually
definition.
cutting in and out. Can you hear me?
Can I can
You're
hear you?
cutting in and out just a little bit. Yeah, you're cutting in and out just a little bit. It looks like the internet connection might be a little slow. But try it again. I think you're start where you were. You're starting to give your problems with this view.
Oh, okay. So you heard me explain what Katherine Jenkins' view was, right?
Yep. Yeah, I got that part.
Okay. So the worry is that it looks like this might be vicious because what it says is some she takes enough of the right kind of gender norms to be about her. And I think the problem is when you ask which gender norms are we talking about, obviously it's norms about women, right? Those are the norms that you have to take to be about you. But then in our definition of womanhood, we've used the term woman. And so that threatens to make the definition viciously circular. And the problem with a viciously circular definition is it doesn't actually express any proposition. It doesn't really say anything. Um, is that clear enough, or do you want me to explain the
Yep.
problems with vicious circularity?
No, I think
That's
that's fine.
good.
Yep.
Okay. So that's one option. Maybe this definition is viciously circular. Another option is we try to flesh out the term woman in the definition in another way, like the traditional way or the social role way. But then the thought is that's going to exclude a lot of trans women. Because if there are norms about, for example, biological females, the only way that a trans woman could take those norms to be about her is if she thinks, I'm a biological female. Um, and there's going to be at least some trans women who don't think that. Otherwise, there's going to be some irrationality going on here. Or if we adopt the social role definition of womanhood and put that in Katherine Jenkins' definition. Again, as Katherine Jenkins herself points out, not all trans women are women in that sense of the word. They're not all oppressed on the grounds of being observed or imagined to be female.
Mm-hmm.
And so there too, we're going to exclude some trans women because they won't take norms about women in that sense to be about them, because they know they're not women in that sense. Or if they do take those norms to be about them, they're going to be mistaken or irrational. So that's the problem I pointed out. So I guess if you wanted to sum up the worry, it's just this. Attempts to revise our gender terms of man and woman look like they're either going to be viciously circular or they're going to be trans exclusive. And that's, again, simply because, like, when you imagine all the people that we're meant to include in this category of womanhood, according to trans inclusive philosophers, there's simply nothing that all and only those people have in common. And so that's why it's really difficult to come up with a definition. Either it's going to be too narrow and exclude some of the people we want to include, or another option we've seen is it's vacuous and viciously circular.
So here's just a thought before we get onto the ameliorative. I'm not going to be able to say that.
Ameliorative inquiry. Hey, you know what? You could just call it conceptual engineering if you want.
Okay. Ameliorative inquiry. I'm going to try to get it. I want to get it.
Okay.
Before I get there, you made me lose my train of thought. Okay. So maybe the solution to this is, instead of, it looks like we actually had someone in the live chat, super chat here. So I just want to make sure that I acknowledge that real quick. So we had somebody, not my real name. Thank you for the super chat or whatever that was. It says your name is not my real name. So, okay, cool. Thank you. Appreciate it. All right. So what I was going to say is, maybe instead of like giving a definition of what a woman is, then maybe instead we just need to take it case by case. So maybe there is no definition. I don't know if this is a thing in philosophy. Maybe it is. I think actually Alvin Plantinga maybe following like a Reedian style here. So instead of giving a definition of proper basicality, maybe instead of that, we can just look at it case-wise, look at it by examples. What do you think about that? Is that like a fruitful way of going about it? So instead of giving this definition, we're just looking at different cases and saying, well, yes, this is a woman. We don't know what sort of unites them under this definition, but we can still look at these paradigm examples and know that, yes, this is a woman.
Yeah. So I definitely want to avoid what some philosophers call the Socratic fallacy. So that's named after Socrates, because it sometimes looks like when Socrates is talking with people, and then, for example, the person claims to know something about piety or justice or whatever, Socrates then interrogates them and says, oh, cool, you know what justice is, or you know what piety is? Then you must be able to give me necessary and sufficient conditions. And then he beats up on all their attempts to give necessary and sufficient conditions. And then it looks like he concludes, or the reader is invited to conclude, this person didn't really know what justice is after all. They didn't know what piety is after all. And so the fallacy is thinking the only way you could understand what a term means, or sort of grasp a term or a concept, is if you are able to supply necessary and sufficient conditions, like whenever asked. And I mean, the history of philosophy seems to demonstrate that we do have a pretty firm grasp on at least some concepts that we have up until now been totally unable to give necessary and sufficient conditions for. So,
yeah, no, I mean, knowledge is a big one.
Yeah, knowledge, I was just going to say that. So like I worked a lot in epistemology. Epistemologists have been trying for quite some time to come up with an analysis of knowledge, and as of yet, no success. But it still seems like we know what knowledge is, and we know it when we see it. I mean, I'm blanking on the name of the Supreme Court justice who said that about the definition of pornography in a Supreme Court case. But a Supreme Court justice famously said, like, it's hard to define, but I know it when I see it. So that seems to be an option. Like, we might fully grasp a term and understand what a term means. We totally possess the concept, even if we're unable to supply necessary and sufficient conditions. So I don't mean to argue this way. when pressed, trans-inclusive philosophers can't give me a coherent definition. Therefore, these revisionary gender concepts don't make any sense, or they don't really grasp them. Because I don't want to commit the Socratic fallacy. But I think that, knowledge is a good case of when it's a case where we possess a concept even though we can't supply a definition. But there are other cases where you might think somebody can't supply a definition because the concept that they're using really doesn't make any sense or is actually just incoherent. And what would lead you to suspect that? I think it would be if they started, you're learning a new language or something, or you're hanging out with some kids and they've got their own little private language and they're using a word that you're unfamiliar with. Oh, this happens with me with college-age students. They use like hip jargon, I don't know.
Hip jargon.
I don't know. A few years ago, it was like salty for angry or something.
Oh, yeah.
So kids use jargon like that to exclude the old people. And sometimes I'm just like, I don't know what that means. Can you tell me what that means? And then you can see them kind of struggling to define it. So instead, they'll just give me examples. And what if it turned out this way? What if the examples they give you really start looking like a totally disunified set? Like there's nothing that all these things have in common. They tell you, oh, the term applies to automobiles and also planets and also the number 5, but no other numbers or something like that. Then you might start thinking like there's literally nothing that all and only these things have in common. So I don't think this is a coherent concept, And so I think something like that might be happening with these revisionary gender concepts. You sort of, maybe the default assumption should be these concepts make sense even if we can't define them. But when you start seeing who the concepts are meant to be applied to, and you realize these people have nothing in common biologically, they have nothing in common sexual orientation-wise, oppression-wise, life experience-wise, there's nothing they have in common. And I think that's why our conversation in our culture has started landing on self-identification, because that's like the greatest hope for something that all these folks might have in common. The thought seems to be that what unifies the category of womanhood is all and only these folks identify as women. But the problem is like that's viciously circular. So that's why I say it looks like we've got this dilemma. These revisionary gender concepts are either viciously circular or they're going to exclude some trans women.
Yep. Okay, so one thing that I did want to talk about, because in the paper, this was one of the most interesting things that stuck out to me as someone who's interested at a lay level in philosophy, is this whole idea of ameliorative inquiry. That word, I hate it. All right. I can read it just fine, but I can't say it.
Yeah.
All right, so basically the idea, it looks like, is to just sort of ignore counterexamples to your theory. And so let me kind of attempt to explain what this means. And I'm going to give an example that I came up with. So suppose that as I was growing up, I just really, really loved Pluto as a kid. And I was really upset, really hurt when it was declassified as a planet. And so what I do is I come up with a new definition of planet that is Pluto inclusionary. Okay? So I define planet, or I come up with this new definition of planet as whatever is in orbit around a main sequence star. And that would obviously include Pluto, not Plato. So this definition is Pluto inclusionary. But let's say some uppity philosopher comes along. His name is Dr. Bogardus, and he provides a counterexample to my definition. And so on my definition, space stations, according to him, would also be classified as planets, and since they are technically in orbit around the sun. But since I'm engaged in this type of inquiry, I'm not moved by these types of counterexamples. That's what the idea is behind this. Mm-hmm. And I'm only moved by my desire to include Pluto as a planet. And this is essentially what some gender revisionists are doing in your paper, at least what you're saying they're doing, is they're coming up with these new definitions of gender that are trans-inclusive, but when presented with counterexamples that rule out obvious examples of women, like the Queen of England, they aren't moved by these counterexamples because they're only interested in making feminism trans-inclusive. And I think that was really interesting to just sort of ignore counterexamples to your definition because you have this other motive, which is to make feminism trans-inclusive. You want to talk more about that?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I like the Pluto example. I mean, there are even clearer counterexamples if the definition is just anything orbiting a main sequence star. Because I guess that would include us, right? Like we're orbiting the sun. Um, so I guess we would all be planets. And I guess, I mean, you accidentally said Plato, but I guess Plato would also have been a planet too when he was around. Um, so yeah, that seems kind of an unreasonable definition of planet insofar as we're all sort of using the traditional concept of planet. Clearly, I'm not a planet, even though I'm orbiting the sun. Um, so what's up with ameliorative inquiry when it comes to gender? I hear your concerns, and I thought maybe in reply I should try to be like maximally charitable. Let's like turn the charity up to 7, and I'll try to explain to the best of my ability why somebody might be engaged in this project and why even like you might be sympathetic to this project.
Okay.
So the best I could do in that regard was ask you to think about cases where we do modify our language out of respect for decency or kindness. So, for example, we avoid using racial slurs. I mean, I guess you grew up later than I did, but when I grew up, we had words that we just wouldn't use anymore. I don't even want to mention them, but we like called each other certain names. We said, "Don't act like such and such." And now, to be kind and decent, we realize like, ooh, I should really modify the way I speak, so as to not be like mean or bullying or perpetuate negative stereotypes about people.
Mm-hmm.
So that's step one. Realize that out of respect for kindness and decency and just advancing the cause of social justice, you might put it, we are willing to modify the way we speak. And now I noticed that not only are we willing to just avoid certain words, but we're also willing to like introduce new words. So, for example, it used to be that it was quite common to call police officers just policemen, and firefighters, we'd call them firemen. And we had gendered terms for certain kinds of professions that were very common. And we've sort of moved away from those gendered terms to gender neutral terms. Now we say like police officer and firefighter. And in fact, we've kind of moved away from waiter and waitress to just server. We've moved away from stewardess on an airplane to like flight attendant. And I think actually like there's even some push to move away from actor and actress to just actor. I guess there's no like happy third option there. They're just all actors now. Um, and I used to think this was kind of like silly or like political correctness run amok. But I remember when my daughter was young, when she was like 3 or 4, we were reading like an older sort of children's book that was talking about policemen and firemen. And I remember thinking like, if I use that word, she's going to get the impression that this profession is only for men. Um, like that's not actually entailed by the book, but like that assumption is delivered by the book. And so I found myself changing those words to police officer and firefighter just because I didn't want to like close off those options to her if she wanted to pursue firefighting or being a police officer. And so that's step 2 of my attempt to be maximally charitable. Not only are we willing to stop using certain words, but we're also willing to use new words, new kinds of words. And sometimes, in this, for the sake of social justice, it's even happened that we've like reappropriated certain terms. So, for example, the term queer used to be like just purely pejorative, but it was reappropriated by the LGBT community, and now it's not pejorative. It's sort of a, I don't know, it's a widely accepted sort of term. And so they thought like that's a good way to diffuse a word that was used as an insult, or sort of going to kind of neutralize it, reclaim it, and in fact use it as a positive term. And so these sorts of things happen in language, and they happen naturally, and sometimes they happen because we're motivated by kindness and decency. And so I think the ameliorative inquirists believe we should do the same thing with our gender terms. The way that we were using words like man and woman, it turns out, are kind of um,
Indecent.
at least mean and indecent, but even like kind of dangerous because like some trans philosophers worry that a major cause of transphobic violence and assault and like murder is the belief that, for example, trans women are deceptive. And so, like, I guess sometimes what happens is in sexual encounters, if somebody is having a sexual encounter with a trans woman and then discovers, like, oh, as they would put it, this isn't really a woman, then they feel deceived or cheated or something, and that might aggravate their anger and maybe push them over the edge to being violent, like maybe even really violent. And so part of the motivation is like, let's change the way we're using these gender terms so that in an encounter like that, the person doesn't have the thought, this is really a man or something like that. They think, this is a woman, but a different kind of woman. This person's not being deceptive or trying to trick me or something like that. Fool that I am, I failed to ask this ahead of time or something like that. And so they're motivated by concerns of decency and kindness and trying to reduce the amount of transphobic violence and bullying and so on. So that's the best I can do to explain to you why somebody would take on this project.
Yeah, it still doesn't seem like that is going to make it okay to ignore counterexamples to your theory. I think you'd still have to deal with those logically.
Well, here's what I'll say. Can I just say this really quick about the counterexample?
Yeah. Go ahead.
The people engaged, there's sort of, if you have a debate about sex and gender, you should get clear on what the parties to the debate believe. So I think there's two ways that somebody might approach these gender debates. Some people think that the ways that our words man and woman have been used were never biological. The traditional, ordinary use of man and woman should and always have included trans women and trans men, and we only now realize that. So they think that like this was always true. Mm-hmm. So some people are in that camp, but other people admit, the ameliorative inquirists admit, that the ordinary use of, for example, man excludes trans women. The ordinary use of man is adult biological male human, and the ordinary use of woman is adult biological female human. And they admit that the ordinary uses of these words are trans exclusive. But they say we should change that. We should revise the definitions. And so if you give them counterexamples and say like, well, on the definition you're proposing, a biological male could be a woman. What do you think about that? They sort of admit that. They're like, yeah, we know on the ordinary use of the concept, you're right. But we're not using the concept in the ordinary way. We're revising it. We're like intentionally changing the definition. Mm-hmm. So it's a stipulative definition. They're saying, let woman now mean this. And you can't refute stipulative definitions with counterexamples.
And that's actually a good segue into the next thing that I want to talk about. And then we're going to go to questions. So if you guys do have a question for Dr. Bogardus, make sure to put it in the live chat. Do it right now because I'm going to start looking after I ask this last question. And tag at Capturing Christianity. That way I can see it very clearly. And I'm going to start to collect your questions, put them in a little document, and then we're going to go through some of your questions that you have for Dr. Bogardus. So start doing that right now. Tag me at Capturing Christianity. All right, so to segue, one of the things that you point out in your paper is that when we do this kind of revision to gender, then what we're doing is ultimately we're changing the meaning of the term. So we're no longer talking about the same word. We're no longer talking about the same concept. Just like if I was to give birth to a son, not if I was to, if my wife was to give birth to a son, and I called him Blaise Pascal, I'm not revising Blaise Pascal. I'm calling a new thing, a new person, Blaise Pascal. It's a new thing. It's a new concept. So I think that was interesting that you pointed out in the papers, that if we do this kind of revision to these well-understood concepts, at least in the past, of what gender meant, then we're talking about something completely unrelated to what we were talking about. It's a new concept.
Yeah. So remember when we were being maximally charitable a moment ago when I gave you examples of like police officer and firefighter?
Yep.
So in those cases, we introduced a new word. And by word, I mean like actual like sound type or an inscription type, like a series of symbols. So we introduced a new word, firefighter or police officer. and then introduced a new concept for that word to express. And so there was no threat of like changing the subject or something like that. Like we knew we were changing the subject. We were like, yeah, we don't want to talk about policemen and police women anymore. We want to talk about police officers, which we admit is now gender neutral. And the same thing happened with the word queer. Like it had a widely used definition that was pejorative back in the day. People who reappropriated it knew that they were changing the subject. They said, we know how you're using the word. We are now going to use the word to express a new concept. And we know that it's a new concept, different from your concept. We are now changing the subject. So what's tricky is in the gender case, the people engaged in a sort of conceptual engineering or ameliorative inquiry, on the one hand, they don't want to change the subject. They want to still be talking about gender. They want to talk about men and women, the sorts of things that we've been talking about for millennia. But they know that the definitions that they're proposing are different from the ones that are in common use, the ones that are ordinarily used. They're intentionally revising these definitions. And so they know that they're sort of dubbing a new kind of property and saying, let's call that property womanhood. And my worry is that when you intentionally propose new definitions and you know that this is not how people are using the word, it's not that you're using the same concepts that other people are using and you've just adjusted the conception. No, invariably, if you intentionally revise the word and propose a new definition, you're introducing a new concept, which means that you're changing the subject and introducing merely verbal disputes. And I think the case you give is really nice. If I name my kid Blaise Pascal, I have used the word in the thin sense of word, like this sound, Blaise Pascal, and that inscription type, but it's a new concept. And we can see that by imagining a case of disagreement. Like, suppose I say in a group of philosophers, hey, Blaise Pascal's at my house right now, or something like that. And they say, no, he's not, he's dead. Like, we haven't really disagreed. There's no genuine disagreement here. It was a merely verbal disagreement, which means that the concept I expressed with Blaise Pascal is different from the one that they expressed with Blaise Pascal. We're using different concepts here.
Yeah.
And so
are you talking about the epistemology of disagreement right now?
Well, I'm saying this isn't a genuine disagreement. This is a merely, I guess I'm talking about the
disagreement.
The epistemology of verbal disagreement. And so the worry is that ameliorative inquiry is kind of, it has this contradiction inside of it. It wants to not change the subject. It wants to stay on the topic of gender. But it also wants to intentionally revise the definitions that we associate with gender terms, which I think inevitably changes the subject. And so I don't think you can have it both ways. Either you stay on the topic and use the words as ordinarily used, or you introduce new definitions, but then we're talking about something new. We're just using old terms in a kind of confusing way. Yeah.
All right, so let's get to some questions. The first one is from Gordon Tubbs. He says, do you find the social constructionist account of gender to be largely arbitrary?
I'm just writing that down real quick. Do you find the social construction account of gender to be arbitrary? Well, I guess we'd have to get clear on what the social construction account of gender is meant to be. The way I understand that phrase, I would say there's more than one social construction account. So there's sort of three camps that you might fall in when it comes to gender. You might think that gender is biological. So gender exists and it's a biological kind. So to be a woman is to be a biological female who's adult and human. And similarly with being a man. Another option is you could be an eliminativist about gender. So some people think we should just give up this gender talk. There's no such thing. And in fact, it sort of underwrites gender discrimination. So let's get rid of it. In the way that some people think, like, it used to be that if people were suffering from epileptic seizures, the diagnosis was in terms of demon possession. And then we came to believe, well, it's not really demon possession. Let's stop calling it demon possession. It's something else entirely. So some people think we should treat gender terms in the same way. There really are no men and women. And in fact, we're sort of perpetuating this system of social hierarchy by using these words, so let's stop using them. That's a limitativism about gender. The third option is what I would call a social constructionist view. These people think gender is real it really exists, but it's merely a matter of social convention. So we created it in the way that we created touchdowns. Touchdowns really exist. They're worth 6 points, but we could change that if we wanted to. And the way we created Texas, like Texas really exists. The laws are different there. The people are different there. And we could change it if we wanted to, and it hasn't always existed. It exists by convention. So if that's what the question means, like what do I think about social construction accounts of gender? And do I think they're arbitrary? I guess what I would say is this second paper that I wrote about gender, and actually just posted it today, I try to show that the arguments that people gave as they moved away from a biological account to a social constructionist account, the arguments that people gave turned out not to be very good. So just as a matter of fact, starting in like the middle of the 20th century, it was pretty widely accepted that there just was biological sex, and to be a man was to be adult human male, woman, adult human female. But then in the middle of the 20th century, especially with Simone de Beauvoir's book, The Second Sex, feminist philosophers started moving in the direction of social construction accounts. And what I do in this new paper is I tried to collect all the arguments that people gave in favor of these social construction accounts, and it turns out that they're not very good. So I guess I would just refer the questioner to that paper that I just posted today. I think that would answer the question.
Okay, cool. Let's move on to the next one. This one is from Christopher Gogo. He says, so in the last sentence of his abstract on his paper on sex-gender distinctions, says that philosophers should, quote, cultivate a variety of feminism that's consistent with traditional biologically based definitions of woman and man, end quote. I wonder if he's familiar with difference feminism, and if so, does he not think it qualifies as a variety of feminism consistent with traditional definitions?
The question was, am I familiar with difference feminism?
Yep, difference feminism.
I am not. I will have to look that up. And so that's the shortest answer to any question I've ever given.
With traditional definitions. Okay. All right. Well, then we'll use that as a follow-up. All right. So the next one is from Not My Real Name. He says, we could unify a broad range of feminist views by seeing them as committed to the very abstract claims that there's two different claims, a descriptive claim and a normative claim. The descriptive claim is women and those who appear to be women are subjected to wrongs and or injustice, at least in part because they are or appear to be women. That's the descriptive claim. The normative claim is the wrongs or injustices in question in one ought not to occur and should be stopped when and where they do.
Okay. That's the end.
That's not really a question, yeah. But
yeah. So maybe the question is, what do you think?
What do you think about
What do you think about that? And so the suggestion was we could unify a broad range of
feminist views. Feminist views by seeing them as committed to the very abstract claims.
As committed to very abstract claims, and then there's a descriptive and a normative claim.
The descriptive claim is women and those who appear to be women are subjected to wrongs or injustices, at least in part because they are or appear to be women.
Yeah.
And then the normative claim is that these injustices ought not to occur and should be stopped when and where they do.
Yeah, well, I mean, I don't mean to set myself up as like the arbiter of feminism. I'm not really in a position to say how feminism ought to be defined, but having said that, I will now say that sounds right to me. I mean, that does seem to unify a broad range of feminist views. I guess the question just arises, the debate arises when we start wondering, how do we understand the word women in those claims? When we say that like women and those who appear to be women are subjected to wrong because they are or appear to be women. What do we mean by that? Do we mean the traditional definition of women, like biological female? If so, this is going to exclude some trans women. If not, how do we understand the word woman in those two claims that the questioner provides? And then, I mean, that is the locus of the debate that I'm trying to contribute to in some small way with these papers.
Okay, let's move on to the next question then. This one is from Border Dude 119. He says, is this new definition of gender different from or the same as what we call personality or individual tastes? This new definition of gender different from or the same as what we call personality or individual tastes?
Well, I'm not sure what this new definition of gender is. Does the questioner, maybe the questioner means a sort of psychological definition of gender, where to be a woman, you identify as a woman, to be a man, you identify as a man? Or did the questioner mean something else? Either way, I guess, like, whatever the questioner had in mind, I don't think that anyone means to propose a definition of gender on which it's equivalent to personality or individual tastes. Because certainly you have some aspects of your personality and you have some individual tastes that I think all parties to the debate would say have nothing to do with gender. So like maybe you prefer chocolate to vanilla, that has no bearing on your gender. But maybe what the questioner is asking is, on this new definition of gender, a psychological account, is gender just is it an aspect of your personality? Is it something like a personal taste? I guess if the new definition of gender is a kind of psychological state, it's a certain belief you have about yourself, maybe that counts as an aspect of your personality. I don't know, man, it's kind of fuzzy what personality is and when something's in and when something's out, but if it's a psychological state and it has to do with who you are as a person, maybe it counts as an aspect of your personality. So sure, if the questioner means the psychological account of gender, yeah, I guess that counts as an aspect of your personality. Is it a kind of personal taste? Well, personal taste sounds a little bit like we're trivializing it or saying that it might like come and go. I think most people who adopt this view of gender think that in order to count as a woman, you have to regularly and for the most part identify as a woman. Maybe all the time, but at least regularly and for the most part. So it's not like a whim that comes and goes. It's not a fashion or something. It's not something you put on for the weekend and take off during the week.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that's what these folks would say who propose this new psychological definition of gender.
All right, so here's another question from Not My Real Name. And so before, what he was doing was he was giving a quote, apparently. And that was the descriptive versus the normative claim thing that he gave earlier. But we've got a different question from him. He says, can't we see redefining women and man, female, and male as a move towards the ultimate goal, progress in eradicating sexism? I'll repeat it one more time. Can't we see redefining women, man, female, and male as a move towards the ultimate goal, progress in eradicating sexism?
Well, I think the ameliorative inquists are quite explicit that that is how they see it. They think we should redefine these terms in order to eradicate sexism, so discrimination on the basis of sex, but also discrimination on the basis of gender. They think that redefining these terms will help not only ameliorate violence and oppression of women, cis women, but also trans women. So yeah, I think that is how they view it. I guess my question is my concern is, I think that's a laudable goal for sure, count me in. But it's quite often assumed that this sort of conceptual revision will help in that way, more often than it's argued that this sort of conceptual revision will help in that way. There's not much evidence that this kind of conceptual revision will help. And I mean, to see that, just notice that there are other kinds of unjust oppression that we want to fight against. And yet in those areas, we haven't undergone this sort of conceptual revision. So I'm thinking, for example, of discrimination on the basis of race, discrimination on the basis of age, discrimination on the basis of like immigration status. There's all kinds of discrimination out there where we don't revise the crucial terms in this sort of way. We don't say, well, there's all this tension between like black people and white people and Hispanic people and so on. Let's revise our racial terms in a psychological way. Let's let race be a matter of self-identification. And in fact, we kind of recoil from that suggestion that race would be a matter of self-identification. And the same thing with age. So elder abuse is a real thing, like discrimination on the basis of age is a real thing, and it's terrible. And we don't say as a result, well, let's call people whatever age they sort of identify as. So if someone thinks, I actually feel like a 30-year-old, please treat me that way, and in fact, give me the legal status of a 30-year-old. Again, we kind of recoil from that suggestion. Or at least we think we don't need to do that in order to combat ageism. And we don't need to revise our racial terms in order to combat racism. What we do instead is we try to trim the conceptual connections that some people have associated with their racial terms. So some people have associated with their age terms. They think old with regard to age means something like incompetent or untrustworthy or something like that, or boring. I don't know. I'm just trying to relate the negative stereotypes that we have associated with older people. What we do instead is we try to trim those stereotypes away and realize you can be older without having those sort of negative traits. And same thing with our racial categories, same thing with our immigration status categories. So why can't we do that as well with our gender categories? As far as I know, nobody's really answered that question. So it's not. We have precedent. We've advanced the cause of social justice in other areas without this sort of radical conceptual revision. So why think it's necessary when it comes to gender?
So do you have time for a couple more questions?
I have a lot of time.
Okay.
My semester's over. My grading's turned in.
Oh, nice.
Let's answer some more questions.
All right. So this one is from Epic Christ. So if you guys have more questions for Dr. Bogardus, then feel free to ask them in the chat. We'll go probably for another half hour here. I've got to get some lunch eventually, but yeah, for another half hour or so, we'll go ahead and do some more questions. So if you have some, ask them in the chat, the live chat, do at Capturing Christianity. That way I can see it. All right, next one is from Epic Christ. He says, if you believe in dualism, then you believe in a soul, but how can a soul have a gender?
Okay, so I guess this questioner knows that I believe in dualism and in immaterial souls. And then the thought seems to be so the argument is you believe in souls and in dualism. And then I think the sort of implicit premise is if souls exist, then they're gendered. And then the conclusion is you believe in gendered souls. Mm-hmm. And then maybe the argument proceeds by saying that's ridiculous or something like that, or what would that mean? So in response to that sort of objection, I guess I would say I don't accept that second premise that says if you believe in immaterial souls, you have to think they're gendered. I know that some dualists believe that souls come in one of two flavors, like male or female, masculine or feminine, man or woman. But I guess I don't think that's true, or at least I'm just kind of agnostic on the question. I would have thought that a soul is just an immaterial thinking thing. And in fact, I think that God is that sort of thing. God is an immaterial thinking thing. God is an immaterial mind. And I don't think that God, the triune God, has a gender. I think that the second person of the Trinity became incarnate, took on a male body, but I don't think that makes God gendered, and I don't think souls are gendered. So I guess that's my response. And I think that's a good question. What would it mean to say that souls are gendered? And
someone even said in the live chat, don't you believe that God has a gender? So what are your thoughts there?
I don't think God literally has a gender, although, maybe the next follow-up question is, well, then why do we always call God he, or
the Father?
Are you down with gender-neutral language with referring to God? So I think that sometimes we use gendered language in a kind of metaphorical or analogical way. So, I don't often talk about ships, but I guess in English we preserved some gendered language when it comes to ships. And we think that when a ship is commissioned, we dub it with a feminine name, or at least we call it she. We say she is quite seaworthy, matey, or something like that. And maybe that's because people used to view ships as having some sort of important feminine characteristics. I don't know. But they didn't think that ships were literally female. They thought, we're going to call ships with this feminine language. We're going to use feminine language to describe ships because ships are in some important way feminine. I think that's what's going on when the Bible uses masculine pronouns for God and when Christians often call God Father or He. I think what they're saying is God has certain salient features that are masculine or father-ish, quite quite analogous to an actual father. So I don't think we don't literally mean that God is a father, that God literally begets through the production of spermatozoa and so on. I think we mean that he's father-ish. And so we
Hmm.
use this word in like an analogical or metaphorical way. So does that mean that like we could just as rightly call God mother or call God she? Well, I don't know. The Bible seems to suggest that God's characteristics are best described in an analogical or metaphorical way, in a masculine way. So, I mean, this isn't something I've thought a ton about, but that's what I would say. Calling God
Yeah.
father or he doesn't literally mean biological male.
Yeah, I remember reading Peter Van Inwagen arguing basically the same exact thing in one of his books. I can't remember which one it was. I think it might have been the one on evil, which would be a weird book to see that in. But anyways, so this next question is from Emma Grace. She says, "Why do trans-inclusive philosophers ignore the obvious harm and conflict in changing ideas of gender against cis people in favor of trans suffering?" Why do trans-inclusive philosophers ignore the obvious harm and conflict in changing ideas of gender against cis people in favor of trans suffering?
Yeah, so I think the questioner puts his or her finger on something really important. I mean, that is a fault line in our contemporary cultural debates, especially in the UK, but also in the US. I mean, we're starting to see that when the rubber meets the road, not everybody's interests can be satisfied. So a lot of cis women have an interest in preserving spaces just for biological females. So, for example, bathrooms and changing rooms, but more seriously, women's shelters. They want to preserve that space for females who have been abused or assaulted by men, and also prisons. I mean, that is another really serious issue. Who gets to go to which prison? And it looks like these two groups can't both have their interests met. So you can't both preserve these spaces for biological females and also allow access to trans women, for example. Oh, and then also sports is another area. So we're starting to see a real conflict between these two interest groups. And if the question is, why do trans-inclusive philosophers ignore the harms to cis women that their sort of agenda is producing? I guess I would say, well, they definitely don't ignore it. They address it. I guess what they think is the harms that the questioner brings up are not as grave or are not as serious as the harms to trans women that would occur if we didn't change the policies in the way that they propose. So yeah, it's not that they ignore the harms, they just think in the case of these two competing interests, the interests of trans individuals wins. And they would probably say, and they often do say, the harms to cis women are being overblown. That's probably what they'd say.
Hmm. All right, next
Yeah.
question is from Shannon Q. She says, "Hey, capturing Christianity, unlike race, age, etc., wouldn't there be clear aspects of gender that are behavioral and not solely aesthetic?" Unlike race, age, etc., wouldn't there be clear aspects of gender that are behavioral and not solely aesthetic?
Aren't there aspects of gender that are behavioral, not aesthetic? I guess what the questioner has in mind is the sort of gender norms that we have in our culture and cultures typically have. So the ways that women are typically expected to behave and the ways that men are typically expected to behave. So, I mean, for example, just a simple example is like ways that you're kind of allowed to sit if you're a man or a woman. Um, so if you're a woman, there are certain ways you're allowed to sit. I guess you kind of have three options. Like there's ways to cross your legs, ways to keep your legs together. There are ways that women would sit that we would view as like violating cultural norms, whereas men seem to have more options. I guess that's one example that people often give. There are certain kinds of
I
professions
think
that.
I think what she's getting at is that gender inherent to it is not just the way that you look, but it also has to do with how you behave.
Yeah. So I get,
That's
yeah,
sort of
there are
what
certain
defines your gender. I think that might be what
there's
she's
yeah,
getting at.
there are certain behaviors that we associate with men and other behaviors that we associate with women.
Hmm.
And then the thought is, well, isn't that a disanalogy between gender on the one hand, race, age, immigration status, religion on the other hand? Well, I don't think so. There are certain behaviors that we associate with people of different ages. I mean, it's possible for an adult to act like a child, for example,
Hmm.
and that's typically not a good thing when you say that. So there are certain behaviors that we associate with children, certain behaviors that we associate with adults, um, and I'm not passing a positive or a negative judgment on this. I'm just reporting or suggesting, doesn't the same thing go with race? Isn't it possible for like a person of one race to act like somebody of another race? I'm not saying that's good or bad. I'm just saying like, don't we have certain stereotypes or associations between being a member of a certain group or ethnicity or race and the kind of behavior that you engage in? I'm not saying that's good. In fact, it's probably bad, and we should stop having those stereotypes. But the stereotypes do exist, just as they do with gender. I mean, you might think the gender norms are bad and should be eradicated as well. The point here is just there is no disanalogy here. It looks like in both cases there are certain associations that we have between the category or the concept on one hand and certain kinds of behaviors on the other.
Hmm. I like
So if
that
the
answer.
thought, yeah, so if the thought was, well, here's why we can revise when it comes to gender, but we can't revise when it comes to race. The difference is um, conceptual connections between the categories and behaviors. Well, I don't think that's a disanalogy. I think those exist in both cases.
All right, let's go on to the next question, which is from Nullius in Verba. All right, I don't
Oh,
know if that's a boy or girl. He or
that's
she
the
or
hey,
cis, he,
that's the
they,
slogan of the that's the slogan of the British Royal Society.
what is?
Nullius in verba.
Oh,
It means
interesting.
on the word of nobody. That's like the slogan of the Enlightenment.
Oh,
We've got an
cool.
Enlightenment person here in the questionnaire.
Wow.
Yeah.
Well, here we go. What are your thoughts on people with chromosome disabilities? What gender, quote unquote, gender would they fall under? People with XXY, XXX, etc.
Yeah. So I guess this person is asking about intersex individuals. Um, this is actually an argument that philosophers have given against biological definitions of gender. So the suggestion is to be a man is to be an adult human male, to be a woman is to be an adult human female. And then some philosophers have objected in this way. They say, well, if gender terms really were defined in terms of sex like this, then intersex people shouldn't be possible. Everybody should fall neatly and easily, as philosopher Jennifer Saul says, everybody should fall neatly and easily into one of the two categories, either man or woman, male or female. So that's premise one. If the biological definitions of gender are true, then everybody should fall neatly and easily into one of the two categories. Premise two is there are intersex people who don't fall neatly and easily into either of the categories. So, conclusion, the biological definitions of these gender terms are wrong. I would deny the first premise of the argument that said if the biological definitions are true, then everybody should fall neatly and easily into one of the two categories. I don't think that our ordinary understandings of these gender terms requires that everybody falls neatly and easily into one of the two categories. I mean, virtually all of our biological categories are vague in this way. There are borderline cases. Even the central concept of biology, life, is vague in this way. We think that there is a real difference between being alive and being dead, but that doesn't mean that everything that you could point to is either clearly in one category or the other. I mean, every time something dies, it moves through the gray area between life and death, and it's often unclear when death has occurred. I mean, if just ask any sort of doctor who specializes in end of life care, and they'll tell you, I mean, there's just a transition that occurs, and you can't draw a sharp line and say, here's where death happened. And yet, nevertheless, we think there really is a difference between life and death. Um, the same thing.
I'm gonna have to. Hey, Thomas, real quick, you're breaking up again. Can you hear me?
It's not. Oh, sorry. Yes.
Yeah, the connection was just getting a little weak there. So let's step back and yeah, go ahead.
So I was just saying that like a lot of our biological categories are vague. And I was saying that the category of being an adult is vague. So there are clear adults and there are clear non-adults, but then there are a lot of people in between. In fact, virtually all of our concepts are this way. Our concept of like a cup is this way. Our concept of glasses is this way. Our concept of being rich and being poor. Virtually all of our concepts outside of math and logic allow for borderline cases. So I would say this, it's no surprise then that the same thing goes here with our biological sex categories. Even if sex is binary and there are males and females, it doesn't follow that there couldn't be borderline cases. In fact, given that these are biological categories, that's exactly the sort of thing you should expect, that there would be borderline cases. So yeah, again, I deny that first premise that says if gender is biological, then intersex people can't exist. No, I think that even if gender were biological, there could be borderline cases. And in fact, there are.
All right, next question from Gordon Tubbs. Do you think cases of Klinefelter syndrome, triple chromosome, and or double genitalia are difficult to square with binary views of gender? We just answered that, so I guess we can move on. Last two questions. One's from Christopher Gogo. He says, so if I recall correctly, and this one is a long one, he posted it in I think 2 or 3 comments. He says, the Dr. Bogardus, said that he doesn't see the warrant in demarcating sex and gender in order to advance the cause of social justice.
Oh, okay. I was going to stop you right there because I thought that was like a false presupposition, but maybe I should just let you finish.
Okay. But given that biological essentialism was the basis upon which women were oppressed, females are naturally X, therefore they should be treated as Y. Isn't it at least relevant to consider distinctions between sex and gender so as to demonstrate that females don't necessarily fall into certain categories that historically have served as the basis for oppression?
Okay, so let me see if I got all that.
I'll repeat it one more time. I'll repeat the whole thing. Yeah. So Dr. Bogardus said that he doesn't see the warrant in demarcating sex and gender in order to advance the cause of social justice. But given that biological essentialism was the basis upon which women were oppressed, females are naturally X, therefore they should be treated as Y. Isn't it at least relevant to consider distinctions between sex and gender so as to demonstrate that females don't necessarily fall into certain categories that historically have served as the basis for oppression?
Okay, so in the paper that I just posted today, I respond to this sort of concern. And I think the questioner is right to bring it up. If you ask philosophers why believe in a sex-gender distinction, why think that gender is distinct from sex, it's based on my research, it seems like the number one answer is we need to avoid what philosophers often call biological determinism. And I think that's a better term for it than biological essentialism. And I think that the questioner is asking about what I would call biological determinism. And the view is that like your biology determines your social features, your psychological features, and can make you fit or unfit for certain kinds of social roles. And so a lot of sexist oppression was based on the sort of view that females are by nature like unfit for politics or something like that. That's what some sexists have said in the past. So I would call that biological determinism. And if the question is, don't we need the sex-gender distinction to combat that sort of thought, to combat that basis for sexism? I would just reply that no, you don't need the sex-gender distinction to combat that sort of sexism. And in fact, it's hard to see how the sex-gender distinction will even help. So here's what I mean. Even if you think that women are just adult human females and men are just adult human males, you can still combat biological determinism. You can still say it doesn't follow that Females are like unfit for politics or something like that, or men are unfit for childcare or something like that. You don't need the sex gender distinction to combat biological determinism. Biological determinism is pretty easy to combat without the distinction. And in fact, people were combating it before the distinction was introduced. And there are other languages without the sex gender distinction where you could still express your opposition to biological determinism and I think successfully refute it without using the distinction. Also, it's hard to see how the distinction will even help. So the distinction is supposed to be, well, being an adult human female is one thing, but being a woman is something else. The sexist says, well, anybody who has this sort of biology, namely all the women, is going to be like unfit for politics or something like that. How does this response help refute the sexist? The response is, well, you might be right about biological sex, but gender is something else. So what you say may or may not be true with regard to adult human females, but womanhood is something else. Maybe women could be fit for politics even if adult human females aren't. I mean, I just imagine the sexist immediately retrenching and saying, I don't know what you mean by this womanhood talk. I just mean adult human females aren't fit for office. I mean, how does the distinction even help? The sexist is still going to be sexist with regard to adult human females. Isn't it better to like attack the root of the problem, which is the assumption that being female makes you unfit for office? And in fact, the questioner sort of responded or expressed the concern in just this way. The questioner said, shouldn't we consider distinctions between sex and gender so as to demonstrate that females don't necessarily fall into categories that historically, I forgot how the question ended, but it's interesting that the questioner used...
That historically have served as the basis for oppression.
Okay. That historically has served as... Well, the categories that have historically served as the basis of oppression was the category female. So what we should do instead is just address that assumption that like being in that category, being female, makes you unfit for political office or whatever, or makes you the proper subject of oppression. The sex-gender distinction doesn't prevent anybody from being female. It doesn't move anybody out of that category. It just creates another category. So all the people that were in that category that the sexists were oppressing are still in there, and the sexist still has these sexist notions. So how does the distinction help refute the sexist? I guess that's what I would wonder. Why not just challenge the assumption that if you're a female, then you're unfit for office or we should oppress you? Just attack sexism head on, attack the sexist head on. I don't think the distinction helps refute sexism.
All right, so last question that we have is actually a good segue to end the episode. And it is, what are some books that he recommends on this topic? So what are your favorite works, favorite books? Maybe even mention some articles that you've read recently that were particularly illuminating. I can't like write them down, so you're just going to have to listen to what he says in response.
Well, I mean, mostly I would recommend articles, but for books, let me recommend some. Just going to pull some up here. So a recent book from, sorry, I don't totally know how to pronounce her name, and I really should. It's Mari, and then Mikola. Yeah, it looks like Mary, but it might be Mari. I don't know. That last name is Mikkola. So I think it's Mary Mikola. Might be Mari Mikola. Recent book is titled The Wrong of Injustice. The Wrong of Injustice, Dehumanization and Its Role in Feminist Philosophy. I'm reading through that now, and I think it's really cool. Sally Haslinger, there's a book that sort of compiles a lot of her most influential articles, and it's called Resisting Reality. Resisting Reality, Social Construction and Social Critique. So that's by Sally Haslinger. Another good article that I mentioned previously was from Catherine Jenkins. It's called Amelioration and Inclusion, Gender Identity and the Concept of Woman. That's by Catherine Jenkins. She has a more recent paper that I think is really cool, and it's called Toward an Account of Gender Identity. Toward an Account of Gender Identity, and that is also by Catherine Jenkins. Um, on the other side, I would recommend if you wanted to like appreciate both sides of the debate, Alex Byrne, Byrne, Alex Byrne at MIT just published a paper. Um, oh, okay. I was blanking for a second on the title, and that was really embarrassing. But the title is "Are Women Adult Human Females? Are Women Adult Human Females?" So that is
And
a
he's
brand
gender
new.
critical.
Yeah, well, he's certainly arguing against the sort of trans-inclusive feminism. He thinks that women are adult human females. You might also want to check out work by, if you want to read work from the gender critical position, check out papers by Kathleen Stock, Sophie Allen, Holly Lawford Smith. There's others too. I'm sort of blanking. I wish I'd written this down ahead of time.
It's okay.
There's others I should be mentioning.
What I can do is, if you want to send me an email or a message with some recommendations, and I can pin it in a comment on the video.
Okay, let me just.
And I can tell people now to just go see the comment later on.
Okay.
And that way they can have links and everything to it directly. So.
There's another. Let me just mention one more.
Yeah, go ahead.
So I'm mentioning a lot of papers. That doesn't necessarily mean I endorse them. In fact, I think a lot of these papers have some things that I think are false. But here's an important paper that people should read. It's by Robin Dembrov, who's at Yale, and the title is Real Talk on the Metaphysics of Gender. Real Talk on the Metaphysics of Gender by Robin Dembrov. Dembroff.
All right, yeah. So send me a link, or send me a few of the recommended resources that you said there, and I'll put it in a pinned comment in the video below. So if you want to scroll down to the comments, then you can actually see the pinned comment and look through all the different resources that I have linked there. And I don't have it linked right now for people who are watching live, but give me a day or so and I'll have it updated. So thanks for coming back on, Dr. Bogardus. You've touched on a lot of different areas in epistemology and religious thought. And it's like one of the things that I want to interview you about is the evolutionary argument against naturalism, because you have another really interesting paper on that. So if we can do an interview or maybe a live discussion between you and another philosopher, I'd love to have you back on.
Okay, I'd be happy to do this again. Thanks, Cameron.
Awesome. And if you guys want to learn more about what I'm doing, follow me at Capturing Christ on Twitter. We also have a Facebook page and a website, capturingchristianity.com. And like I mentioned, I am supporting my family through this ministry. So if you want to help, and if you find value in the content, head over to patreon.com/capturingchristianity and donate to make this ministry continue to happen. All right. And appreciate you guys hanging around, and hope you guys have a good one. See you later.